There is consensus among geopolitical experts that 2024 is a definitive year in shaping the United States' long-term position in great power geopolitical competition of the 21st century. I'm Guy Taylor, National Security Editor at the Washington Times, and this is the first part of a special Washington Times Threat Status video series with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a research institute focused on identifying, analyzing, and eliminating U.S. national security threats on the global stage. We're super fortunate to be joined by Foundation for Defense of Democracy's founder and president, Clifford May, the journalist, writer, commentator, influencer, and by the way, regular geopolitics columnist for the Washington Times. Cliff, let's jump right into it. The last time that I actually sat down to interview you was at the start of the Biden administration. The world was in the throes, the height of the COVID pandemic. And you were really one of the first prominent national security experts to speak openly about what at the time you were calling a full-blown, if I remember the article, a full-blown U.S.-China Cold War. You said the full-blown U.S.-China Cold War had broken out. Now we're 3 years ahead. Do you still feel that this is a good way to describe the current dynamic of great power politics? And are we in a Cold War with China?
Right. So let's unpack that. I mean, yes, the simple answer is yes. There's no question in my mind that this is a Cold War. I'm not alone in thinking that. H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor, he has characterized it that way. Neil Ferguson, the great historian, he has characterized it that way. Quite a few others have as well. There are those who say, okay, and I recently had this conversation with General David Petraeus, and he said, well, you know, it's not exactly the same as the other Cold War, and I totally agree with that.
Some call it Cold War 2.0.
Cold War 2.0, and look, hot wars are not all alike. If you go from the World War II to Vietnam to Korea to the Gaza war, hot wars are different, so are Cold Wars, but there's a lot that is similar. I think what worries me most is that this Cold War, if you call it that, is more challenging even than the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union.
Why?
As General Petraeus pointed out to me, we didn't have a lot of trade with the Soviet Union.
Right, we have massive trade with China.
Massive trade with China. Very hard for us to de-risk, deconflict, disengage. Very hard to see how we do that. We depend so much on China economically. I don't know that that's a good thing, but it's going to be hard to unravel that in any smart way. But there's something else. When we fought in the Cold War, if you want to call that the Soviet Union, yes, the Soviet Union had allies, satellites that had the Eastern European countries. No question about it. But what do we have today? Well, we have Xi Jinping, the Communist Party of China. He now has a no limits partnership with Vladimir Putin of Russia.
Right.
And the third partner is the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Mm-hmm.
Junior partners include North Korea, which is now nuclear armed, developing increasingly sophisticated missiles that they can send nuclear weapons to any target in the world. Also, who else is in this group? Well, I would say Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and increasingly a list of countries in Africa that I follow, having once been a New York Times correspondent in Africa, but most people couldn't mention. But they are being recruited, colonized, dominated increasingly by China or Russia as well. So we're facing an axis. I would say that is
but before we go
very dangerous.
Before we go into that, because I actually want to ask you specifically, I had spoken with Robert Joseph about this concept.
Yes, I know. I read your piece on that. Yeah.
But before we get into that, let's drill into why it is. Let's imagine that some of our viewers are young policymakers, staffers on Capitol Hill in the legislature in Washington, or young voters that are going to be looking at the U.S. election, and they say, well, why do I care about this? Why does this matter? Actually, you're in a position where if you are confronted with an audience of young people who say, I don't care about some Cold War with China, what is the relevance of this?
The relevance is, if I'm talking to these young people, this is the world you will live in. This is the future you will live in. This is a question of who dominates the world. There is always has been some kind of international order. Now, it's easy not to understand that or see that, just like a fish would be unaware of water. We are unaware of the international order. But the international order young people have grown up in. and people like me have grown up in, was that it was an international order constructed after World War II, but primarily by the United States, and to an extent its allies such as Great Britain. The international order means, I would say, a very fundamental part of it is, having seen what happened in World War II, it is no longer okay, no longer permissible for big bully powers to swallow their smaller, weaker neighbors.
Right.
That's right. Nazi Germany took over Europe, right? Japan took over China and most of the Pacific, right? Italy took over Abyssinia, and it was a partner for Hitler. We said, no, there will be nation states, and nation states will have borders, and these borders will not be crossed, certainly not by foreign militaries, to wipe them out. And what do we have right now? Well, we have Vladimir Putin. He's fighting a war to conquer and subjugate the people of Ukraine.
Okay.
We have Communist China looking at Taiwan, saying that's not a separate country, that's ours. We're going to take it when we're ready to. We have the Islamic Republic of Iran dominating Syria, supporting the Houthi rebels in Yemen, increasingly taking over Iraq, absolutely dominating Lebanon through Hezbollah, and wanting to exterminate, not subjugate, Israel. And these
are autocratic powers.
Autocratic
that
powers
are not interested in free political debate or equality of voices within a society. This is very different from the United States, where we have a chaotic public debate, but we have free speech, and much of the democratic world has that. So you're seeing it as correct me, not a clash, but a rivalry between that free world and this autocratic world.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. They're autocratic, they're authoritarian, even I would say totalitarian in some ways. I don't think that's wrong. I would also say that they're all tyrannies. They all tyrannize their own people, and those they want to conquer and subjugate, they also are tyrannical towards. That's why I've been calling them, since at least March, with Waller Newell, who's an expert. He's an academic expert on the history of tyrannies throughout the ages. We call them an axis of tyrannies. And by the way, the phrase axis is a phrase first used by Mussolini in 1936, when he said that his partnership with Nazi Germany, it was a protocol. He said it's an axis around which other countries will soon revolve. That's how he meant it. And of course, he said it's an axis for peace, but what he meant was domination of Europe.
So if we're going to frame it as an axis, I mean, I'm not hearing the Chinese calling it an axis. I'm not hearing the Russians calling it an axis. I hear a lot of talk out of Moscow and Tehran about strategic partnership. You hear similar language out of North Korea and China. But if we were to look at this idea of an axis of authoritarians, help define what this axis actually is. What is the tissue of relationships between the four? And is it an alignment, an alliance? And when I say the tissue, I mean across the so-called dime, the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic spheres, because clearly China, out of those four countries, is a massive economic power in comparison to the other three. So what about military-to-military relations? Are we now seeing a situation where there's more military-to-military relations between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, or between individual countries within that four?
Right. So in a way, all of the above. So you have Tehran supplying missiles and drones and other weapons to Russia. You have North Korea
that are being used in the Russian invasion in Iran.
Being used to kill Ukrainians. That's what they're being used for. That's why Putin needs these weapons, and he's getting them from Iran. He's getting some from North Korea. He's getting ammunition and other things. He's getting some support from Communist China, which is a major military power and quickly building its military capabilities really as fast as it can, because it wants them to be clearly superior to those of the U.S., so that on the day that Xi Jinping, Communist Party leader, decides he wants to take Taiwan, he can deter the U.S. from trying to stop him. Would he be deterred by the U.S. right now? I don't know. I think he looks at, as does Putin, at the U.S. abandonment of Afghanistan and thinks, well, I think it would only be a matter of time. One battleship down, I think that will do it. They look at the U.S. in vis-a-vis Ukraine. We have no boots on the ground, no soldiers we're losing, but it costs money, and there are those saying, well, I'm not sure how long we want to support the Ukrainians. The difference is, and this is an important distinction, You have communist China, Islamist Iran, and I would say neo-imperialist Russia. Putin wants to restore the Russian Empire. That means certainly Ukraine. That's vital for him. But if he achieves that, I think Moldova he would see as low-hanging fruit. And then he'd have to think, okay, what about, I don't know, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland eventually, once was part of the Russian Empire. He'd want all that if he can do it. So these three countries have different immediate ambitions. Russia, Putin, Russian Empire, Islamic Republic of Iran, the Middle East and the Islamic world, China for now, Taiwan, and then the Pacific.
So expanding geographic spheres of influence controlled by this
axis of tyrannies, though I think over time it's...
Let's stick just quickly to Ukraine, because it sounds like your view of how the Biden administration has handled this since the invasion 2 years ago is that we need to continue aiding Ukraine, and we cannot just let the Russians take any part of Ukraine. Am I correct?
You're correct.
This is contentious because this is hotly debated within the Republican Party, and I know that FDD is a nonpartisan think tank. It's an outfit that works closely with administrations of both sides of the aisle. But there's a Republican Party that's really saying, well, how much aid are we going to give here before we spend money on something, say, like the southern border?
So a few points on that. First of all, yes, credit where credit's due. Biden has supported the Ukrainians, but he's given them enough support so that they don't lose, but not enough support so that they really have a chance to win. And I think that's prolonged the war, prolonged the suffering. I think we should have and should be supporting them more fully. Then you're right, within the Republican Party, there is a real divide over this for a number of reasons. One bad reason is that there are some Republicans who I think are delusional about Vladimir Putin. I started going to the Soviet Union more than 50 years ago. I followed Putin for a long time. He is a former KGB colonel who now has an alliance with Chinese communists and Iranian Islamists. He is not our friend. He hates us. He hates what happened when how the Cold War ended, and actually thinks it didn't end. He can still win it. It's just after a bit of a pause. He is not somebody we can work with, and if Putin wins, I think America loses. And I know there are some Republicans who don't agree with that. But
do you subscribe to this line that you'll occasionally hear out of the Biden administration, and sometimes you'll hear it from Republicans as well, that Ukraine, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it's almost the first major victory in what could be a many decades long type of standoff between this axis of authoritarians and the Western world or everyone else?
I'd go beyond that. I would say that becomes a substantial victory for this axis of tyrannies if Ukraine, which is right now an independent nation, a fledgling democracy, wants to be part of Europe, wants to be part of the American-led free world. If we say, well, we supported it for a while, but we got tired, we can't do it. So we have to let it go, and Putin wins.
That sends a message to Beijing vis-a-vis its interests in Taiwan.
If we say, as some conservatives have said, listen, we just, and Biden worries about this, we can't risk a war with Russia over Ukraine, then Xi Jinping knows we surely won't risk a war with China over Taiwan. By the way, it's also important, people say we can't afford it. Biden's spending trillions of dollars on things like forgiving debt with taxpayer money for students, a bogus, I would say, transition to renewable power. Those things are not good. If we have a Cold War, we need to spend more of our GDP on defense. I think and what we certainly need, and this has been a wake-up call, I think, in the war that Russia is fighting against Ukraine, we need to rejuvenate the atrophied defense industrial base so we can produce the weapons we need, and I think to be the arsenal of democracy for our allies.
I think there's a lot of talk about this at the Pentagon with their replicator program right now. Big conference coming early in 2024 focused on the sort of synergy between private American industry and AI and the U.S. military.
Can I make one more point?
One more point.
One more point. And that is, people say, well, we're spending so much money. Again, there are other things we're spending money on that I think are wasteful. But the money, most of the money we're spending on Ukraine, we're spending on Ukraine, we're not spending in Ukraine. Right. We're spending it on American weapons made in American factories by American workers. And then we make new weapons for us that are our new and better version of those weapons, and we need them. So that's where most of our money, and that's a good investment. It's a necessary
Certainly an
investment.
interesting point. Now that we've established this paradigm through which to sort of see great power competition right now, let's shift to the Israel-Hamas clash of the end of 2023 and where we are with it now. But specifically, looking at it in this big picture way, how concerned are you about the idea of an escalation in which perhaps it's the United States aligned with Israel, a patchwork of Western allies, and would China and Russia really align behind Iran in a war with Israel?
So if we are worried about escalation vis-a-vis Iran, and Iran is not worried about escalation vis-a-vis the United States, then let's understand Iran wins and we lose. That's all. That's it. If you and I say, okay, you and I got a beef. And I say, I'm going to fight you. And you say, well, I can't fight you. Guess who wins? I do. And vice versa, right? So that's what we have to say. And Iran, yes, Iran is behind the Hezbollah. Iran is behind Hamas. Iran is behind the Houthis, who are firing missiles at shipping and cutting and trying to shut down shipping in a vital international waterway, right? So that I think is very important that Israel be allowed to totally destroy Hamas's military capabilities in governing, because that is one proxy of Iran that would be off the table, and that would be a defeat for the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has said for 44 years, I was there in 1979, then they started, death to America, death to Israel. Israel is first up because it's smaller. We want to see Hamas destroyed. Hezbollah in time too. Hezbollah has brought terrible suffering to Lebanon, which is pretty close to a failed state at this point, largely thanks to Hezbollah. Is it
possible that Israel could defeat Hezbollah and shift the focus of the war to Hezbollah in Lebanon without having an escalation directly with Iran?
Oh, yes, that is absolutely possible, though a war between Israel and Hezbollah will be very bloody on both sides. But the Israelis also know they got 200,000 missiles pointing at Israeli targets right now. How long are they going to let that situation remain as it is?
We shall see. But that actually brings me, Cliff, last question here. You founded FDD in 2002.
Right, yeah, I started putting together 2001 after the 9/11 attacks.
Right after the 9/11 attacks, the Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States. How has your focus changed? Has the world gotten less dangerous and less complex, or are we looking at an even more, and I think what we've described here is an even more complex and higher stakes landscape of threats. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, to my great disappointment, we haven't managed to put FDD out of business by the U.S. First of all, back then in 2001, 2002, we knew we had a threat from people we were then calling jihadis, Islamists. These were kind of new phrases. But we thought China was going to be pretty much a good stakeholder in the international order. It was in 2001 that Bill Clinton brought China into the World Trade Organization. And he did so very specifically saying, we're going to help make the Chinese richer. And if they get richer and we're helping them do it, they're going to be friendlier and they'll probably moderate, because as people get richer, they want more rights.
And so when you first started FDD, did you have a China program?
No, we didn't have a China program. Didn't think we needed one.
And now
we do. And now we see that China is a key adversary, the key adversary. And Russia too, back in 2001, I think most of us thought, little by little, Russia is going to moderate it. Certainly when I was an exchange student in the Soviet Union, not many people thought the Soviet Union would collapse, but if it ever did, surely after that it would become a European country, a normal country, a free country. I remember going back to Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and talking to journalists and doing workshops, and everybody was very excited that freedom was coming to Russia. Didn't turn out that way.
And finally, so if we are in this axis of authoritarians, a great power, Cold War confrontation between the U.S. and China, with this axis aligned with China, how does this end? Do you see us sort of moving towards eventual military confrontation, or are we heading into a period of a decade of Cold War posturing Which is more likely?
Look, the point of a Cold War, one of the goals in a Cold War, is to keep it cold, not to let it get hot. Now, how do you do that? The best way to do that is through deterrence, to deter your enemies. You deter your enemies through strength, because then your enemies think, I can't succeed by military means. Weakness is provocative. Proper deterrence is very expensive, but it's cheaper than a war. So that's why I get back to what I said earlier. We need to have deterrence. We need to build up our military, spend more on defense as we did during the first Cold War, even more, and make it so that our adversaries think it would be a bad idea to attack us. I'm not sure I don't think that's where we are right now.
Thank you, Cliff May. That concludes this piece of our special Washington Times Threat Status video series with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I'm Guy Taylor. Until next time.